I want to talk a bit about institutions and the role in democracy, and specifically the importance of people feeling empowered. Now, this is very much a catch-all video because actually this is something I wanted to talk about a while back, specifically on the protests in Germany against the perceived rise of the far right. But I thought rather than talking about that specifically, I'd make it a bit broader. I think it's fair to say in the West right now there's a crisis of confidence in a lot of areas. I think there's a disillusion. Maybe it's not entirely new. I mean, the United States right now, politics is particularly bad. You have an 81-year-old president whose age is very much a factor, and his, in most likelihood, opponent who's one of the most polarizing figures ever in American history. But then it's maybe not accurate to say it's an entirely new thing. I mean, if you look at the US in the late 60s, it was very a period of great disillusion as well. So it's not entirely new, but I think there's more of a focus on the candidates individually this time in the role they have, specifically Trump, with where that disillusion lies. You know, he's sort of like a totemic figure in terms of love him or hate him kind of thing. Um, but it's not just the Biden-Trump race in the US. There's, if we look at Europe and getting back to Germany, I mean, why has the AfD risen? They've risen. It's been said that they're planning to deport people not deemed to be German enough. Now, they've denied it, has to be said. But there's been large protests in Germany against them. Even Marine Le Pen has distanced herself from the AfD. Um, some conservatives, react when the far right is mentioned by denying it exists and implying that it's hyperbole, that it's a way to castigate all critics of immigration. Well, I've mixed feelings on that because, on one hand, there are definitely people on the left who are guilty of, weaponizing racism, just throwing it at anyone they disagree with. And I think the German left does that from what I've seen. They tend to just represent anyone who doesn't agree with them as a racist. We get that in the UK as well. And it's all very well saying refugees welcome, but if someone is in a town in Kent or in Sweden for that matter, Sweden is now seeing a major riot, seeing gang violence. A lot of it is from immigrant youths. Um, Sweden's now got the highest gun violence rate outside of Albania in Europe. You know, this is a country that was once held up as a model of Nordic utopia. Clearly, that's an illusion. Um, so, there's things that are, I think, really breaking down the fabric of society. And I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, Europe is not in a situation that some parts of the world are in that are, has to be said, are failed states. We're not in that situation. But let's look at the role of institutions in all of this. I think that when people feel their voice isn't being heard, they will gravitate to the extremes. I mean, that goes without saying. So it's all very well to call AfD supporters racists, but why are they gravitating to it? Because there's genuine concern at mass immigration. I think it's one of the worst things Angela Merkel done was that policy in 2015 of letting in so many people at once. Um, Now, having said that, I'm by no means ideologically sympathetic to blood and soil nationalists. If their policy, for example, of deporting people who aren't of German descent, perceived German enough, to kick them out, that's unworkable. I mean, they have denied that, but it's not really workable. I mean, are you going to say that someone who's a German citizen, maybe three generations they've lived in Germany, but they have Turkish descent or um, otherwise they're going to be thrown out? I mean, it's clearly not workable. Um, They have denied that, it has to be said. Also, there are some dangerous figures in the far right. There was an assassination in Germany a few years ago, Walter Lübcke, um, in a small town, I believe. He was a German mayor, if I've got this right, who was killed by the far right. There was also a plot uncovered over an alleged coup in Germany, and this wasn't just some fringe figures on the internet. This involved quite high level people. So, it shouldn't be dismissed. And we saw from what happened in the United States in January 2021 and Brazil in January of last year that when you get an amalgamation of anger and conspiracy theories together, the results can be toxic. Now, this brings me to the issue of institutions. If people feel their voice isn't being heard, then you'll get demagogues like Trump, Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban in Hungary, who will definitely galvanize, support. I mean, these are totemic figures who are deeply controversial, but they gravitate support because people feel that there's an elite arrogance with institutions. In Europe, most notably, this is with the EU itself. We've seen these huge protests involving farmers, and there's been a lot of overlap with, people have been calling that a rise of the far right. I think there's some overlap, but I think, again, it's a bit like the trucker protests in Canada or the lorry protests in Canada in the in early 2022. Um, it's all very well for people to just dismiss this, but when you have enough anger that people feel they've no choice but to take to the streets, then there's something going on. Now, I want to be very, very clear. I don't care if someone is left, right, or centrist. Um, you cannot give a green light to criminality that is acts of vandalism, no matter how strongly people feel, because then it becomes a free for all. Then people could say that, oh, well, I'm angry about this issue, so I'm going to go and commit vandalism or attack the police or you name it. I mean, to give a UK context here, I feel very strongly about a justice system. It's something I've vocalised a lot. I feel there is a detachment with our legal establishment and public opinion. It's very, very marginally improved. There's been a little bit more transparency. We now see verdicts are televised. And I also want to be clear, I don't think every sentence is wrong. Sometimes I look at a sentence and I think that's about right. But there's still far too many cases where you have a wicked, destructive crime and the sentence just doesn't match the gravity of it. I read a report in the Times about a woman who was burned and she's now in a vegetative state. It was an honour crime. Her family, the perpetrators, got 7 years. One of them got 5 years. One of them got a suspended sentence of 6 months. This for putting a young woman in a vegetative state. Now, I would say it should be a minimum of 15 years. We see situations like this far, far too often, where there seems to be a sentence that just doesn't match the gravity of the crime. And judges can say their hands are tied, but is that always the case? Also in the Times, it was reported there was a judge who was presiding over the case of three women at one of the pro-Palestinian rallies who were wearing paragliders or showing paragliders, obviously a reference to the Hamas attackers. And the judge gave them a suspended sentence. Now, it later transpired that this judge had liked a comment that was pro-Palestinian. That gets into serious questions about his due partiality. Now, to be fair, it is being reviewed. He is under scrutiny, but that just reiterates why judges need to face more scrutiny and why the public need to have a greater say in this. There was anger to that. I mean, those women are criminals. They're terrorist sympathisers, and they should be held to accountability for that. This wasn't a case of, advocating the rights of Palestinian civilians. That was explicitly being pro-Hamas. Um, Obviously, there's very strong feelings about what's happening in the Middle East right now. I would incidentally say the same thing about Zionist extremists who are dehumanizing Palestinians. That's a side that isn't often spoken about, but I think it is also out there. Maybe not so much of Britain, but it's also out there. Um, but institutions, I mentioned the legal establishment. Now I feel very strongly about that. I would like to see a lot more transparency. As an example, and empowerment of the public. There's been marginal improvements. The public victims of crime, particularly now, have a greater say in parole hearings. Good. I give Dominic Raab credit for that, but there's so much more that needs to be done. Example: if the public feel a sentence is unduly lenient, you can write to the Attorney General, right? And the Attorney General can then refer that to the Court of Appeal. But the chances of the original sentence being, increased are minimal, which makes you wonder what is the point. The Sentencing Council say that they have public consultation, but not on every crime. And how much they actually act on, how much actually changes. I have very little faith in the Sentencing Council as a body, because I do think they are, they're legal bureaucrats. None of them are elected. And as much as they might say, oh, we have public consultation, but I know this because I've written to them, I've emailed them, expressing my frustrations and concerns, and that is a retort. Oh, well, we have public consultations. But, you try navigating this system. The legal establishment, it's almost like they make things as complicated as possible. Well, I'm not a victim of crime, but I know that victims of crime, I've seen interviews, I've seen what people feel about this. They feel that they're going up against a monolithic system where it's just so complex. So people must be given a much greater voice in sentencing. Sentencing is a crucial issue. I would particularly cite violent youth crime, youth gangs, antisocial behaviour, dangerous driving. And I'm not talking about someone doing, say, 60 miles an hour in a 50-mile-an-hour zone. I'm talking about someone going drunk down the wrong way of a motorway, killing 3 people, and they'll get maybe 7 years, and then their license suspended for 8 years. Why not a lifetime driving ban? Things like that infuriates me, because it doesn't correspond to the gravity of the offence. And I think a lot of people just don't feel that they have a voice. They feel powerless. The legal establishment, the legal things, one I keep homing in on, but there are other areas. Perceived media bias. Now, the BBC, I accept they have a real big balancing act, and they're going to be damned if they do and damned if they don't, quite honestly. Because on one hand, if it's excessively kind of, put on this focus of due impartiality, then there is a free speech issue. How much can journalists actually comment without being charged with not showing partiality? So I think it's a big challenge, but the BBC is a powerful organisation. It's a very old organisation. It's right that it faces pressure to improve. But you can also look at, I think, just as an example, the sort of salaries that BBC executives get, and then when you consider that there's a threat of jail over non-payment of TV licenses. Now, in reality, very, very few people will face that situation, but it shouldn't be there at all. There is a sense of them and us. If you look at companies, people getting massive bonuses. Other institutions, the post office, after the way they treated the postmasters, that bonus culture is absolutely rotten, and it needs to be urgently reviewed. I would like to see a lot more powerful figures facing justice, quite frankly. Water companies that have polluted our canals and riverways, waterways, I should say. There's still, it's not enough to just cap with bonuses. They need to be facing prison sentences in cases of woeful, deliberate neglect. But there's a lot of other areas that we could look at. Railway companies, the police. I've mentioned police accountability numerous times. I don't think it's good enough when an officer abuses his or her position that the force in question just says a generic apology. They need to change the culture. The training has to improve, and they need to get the priorities right. I think the priorities are utterly wrong. What do people see? They see the police making excuses not to turn up to a burglary or turning up much later, and yet they will harass someone for a non-crime hate incident. Or there's a lack of consistency. You'll have an Islamist hate preacher spewing out venom against Jews, against the West, etc., and the police will say they're looking into it. Yet you have a Christian street preacher, and you can be absolutely sure that they will be straight in there. So I do think there's a lack of consistency. That's a big problem, because I think the police at the moment have really, really bad PR. And, I've heard apologists for the police, and the police themselves kind of blame, oh, the media treats us unfairly, but they have to accept responsibility. The decisions that chief superintendents are taking, the priorities that they're making, a lot of this comes down to the police themselves. And of course, you'll get examples of individual courage and good officers. But frankly, it's not good enough to say, well, oh, don't, it's not fair to always focus on the negative. The point is, the negative is destroying public trust. So it has to improve. We have policing by consent in this country. I'm pro-police. I want to see them working effectively. And more broadly, I want our institutions to work. I am not, for example, against the legal establishment. I just want it to work. I'm against it insofar as I think they're arrogant and out of touch. And it infuriates me, the detachment that seems to be there. But it doesn't mean that I want to tear it all down. I just want it to improve. And this gets into the point about democracy. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about conspiracy theories, because that also comes into it. I'm someone who's very, I don't want to say dismissive, but I'm uneasy about it, because I think it's very callous when I see conspiracy theories talking about crisis actors and so on, and harassing victims of terrorism. It makes me angry. But at the same time, I'm not naive. I can see why, when people feel detached from institutions, when they feel detached from power, they can call it what they will, the deep state, globalist corporations, you name it. But if people feel detached, they're going to pander to that stuff. They're going to go down that rabbit hole. And the problem is, a lot of it is nonsense. A lot of it is hyperbole. It's just pure fiction. But not all of it is without merit. That's why I don't 100% dismiss this stuff. I don't like it, but I can see why, it galvanizes people. Institutions have to listen. They have to listen, and they have to, powerful people, CEOs, executives, politicians, but at least politicians can be voted out of office. You can't say that about judges, or media executives. They need to listen. And I know that the public isn't all going to agree, so I'm not implying that everyone speaks with one voice, but just broadly speaking, the public need to feel more empowered, and I don't think they do. And I think that's why we're seeing a rise in support for the extremes, because people are gravitating towards that because they feel their voices are not being heard. This is, I speak as a centrist. This is where the centre needs to wake up and realise, if the centre is supporting institutions, it needs to pressure those institutions to listen. The EU is one of the most prominent culprits. I think the EU is guilty of arrogance, and I voted Remain, but I've never been a big fan of the EU as an institution, or at least not in recent years. And yet I'm also very wary of nationalism. But, I'm a man of the world, I'm an internationalist, but institutions have to listen to people. Otherwise, the extremes are galvanized. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.